She had nothing left. No money, no name, no place to go. And every single person in that town just stood there and watched. In the brutal summer of 1882, a woman named Clara Whitmore was dragged out of a boarding house in front of the entire town of Redstone, Arizona, accused of theft by a man powerful enough to make the lie sound like gospel. In 60 seconds, her entire life was destroyed. But what that man didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that the woman he threw into the dust was about to become the most dangerous thing he'd ever faced. If you've ever been wrongly judged, stay with me until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat in Redstone, Arizona in July of 1882 was the kind that didn't just sit on your skin. It pressed down on your lungs, squeezed the air out of every breath, and made you feel like the sky itself was trying to flatten you into the cracked red earth. Clara Whitmore had been awake since before dawn. She'd spent the early morning hours mending the torn hem of Mrs. Patton's parlor curtains, a task she'd taken on without being asked because Mrs. Patton's hands shook too badly these days to thread a needle, and because it was simply the right thing to do. After that, she'd swept the front steps of Patton's boarding house, hauled 2 buckets of water from the pump out back, and helped the cook, a round-faced woman named Bess, carry a sack of flour from the delivery wagon that had come in too early. None of this was in Clara's arrangement with the boarding house. She paid her rent, $7 a month, which took every spare cent she could pull together from the sewing work she did for 3 different households in town. And in exchange, she got a small room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced east, a narrow bed, and a hook on the wall where she hung her 2 dresses. The extra work was just who Clara was. She was 26 years old and had been in Redstone for 11 months, having arrived from Tucson after her mother died and left her with nothing but a worn carpet bag, a small silver thimble, and the practical knowledge that a woman alone in the Arizona Territory in 1882 had exactly 2 options: find someone to depend on or learn to depend on herself. Clara had chosen the second option without much deliberation. She was not beautiful in the way that made men stop talking when she walked into a room. Her features were too direct for that. Sharp brown eyes that had a habit of holding your gaze a beat too long, a jaw that sat square and steady like it had been set there on purpose, and hands that were already roughened from work despite her age. She was lean and capable-looking, the kind of woman who moved through space efficiently without wasted motion. She had made herself useful in Redstone. She had made herself quiet. She had made herself, she believed, invisible enough to be safe. She was wrong about that last part. His name was Gerald Holt. He was 44 years old, owned the largest dry goods operation in the territory, controlled most of the water rights in the valley, and had the kind of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He was a large man, not fat exactly, but thick in the way of someone who had once been physical and had since gone soft without noticing. He wore a gold pocket watch on a heavy chain, ordered his suits from a tailor in Denver, and was accustomed to people stepping out of his path before he reached them. He had noticed Clara Whitmore 3 months ago. It had started simply enough: a lingering look when she passed him on the boardwalk, a hand that rested too long on her arm when he greeted her at the general store. Clara had been courteous, as she was with everyone, while making clear through economy of words and careful distance that she was not interested in his attention. Gerald Holt was not a man who received that message gracefully. 2 weeks ago, he had come to Patton's boarding house in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, while Mrs. Patton was out visiting her sister and Bess was in the kitchen. He had climbed the stairs without knocking, knocked on Clara's door, and when she opened it, still holding the shirt she'd been mending for the doctor's family, he had made her what he called a proposition. He would set her up in a proper house on the east side of town. He would give her a clothing allowance. He would take care of her rent, her food, her every material need. All she had to do was be available to him when he wanted company. Clara had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had told him, with perfect composure and without raising her voice, that she would rather sleep in the street. She had closed the door in his face. She had stood very still afterward, listening to his footsteps recede down the hallway, and then she had sat down on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall for a while. Her hands had been shaking, though she hadn't noticed until she tried to pick up the shirt again and found she couldn't hold the needle steady. She had told herself it was over. She had been wrong about that too. The morning it happened started like any other. Clara was in the small sitting room off the main hallway, working on a pair of trousers that belonged to Mr. Simmons at the land office, when she heard Gerald Holt's voice in the front entry. She recognized it immediately. That particular cadence of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him, and she felt the small, familiar tightening in her chest that she'd been carrying for 2 weeks. She kept her head down. She kept her needle moving. She heard Mrs. Patton's voice, startled and thin, then Holt's voice again, louder, and a word that made Clara's needle stop. Thief. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. In the front entry, Gerald Holt stood with 3 men behind him, his foreman, a lawyer named Creech, who handled his business affairs, and a man Clara didn't recognize. Mrs. Patton was pressed back against the wall beside the coat rack, her hand at her throat, her eyes round and frightened. Holt turned when Clara appeared in the doorway. "There she is," he said. His voice was calm. That was the worst part. There was no rage in it, no heat, just the flat certainty of a man who had already decided how this was going to end. "Mr. Holt?" Clara heard her own voice come out steady and was grateful for it. "What is this about? My watch is missing." He drew his coat back slightly to show the empty watch chain hanging across his vest. Gold pocket watch, engraved on the back, worth a considerable sum. "I've had it for 15 years. "I'm sorry to hear that," Clara said carefully, "but I don't see what it has to do with me." "It has to do with you," Holt said, "because you were in my office 2 days ago delivering the shirts you'd laundered for my household. You were alone in the anteroom for approximately 10 minutes while my clerk stepped out." He paused. "And because you're the only person without property or family in this town who had access to that room." The entry had gone very still. Clara could hear the clock on the mantel ticking. "I didn't take your watch," she said. "I'd like to search your room." "No." Something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, he'd expected the refusal. What she saw there was satisfaction, and that was when Clara understood with terrible clarity that she had stepped directly into something he had built, and built carefully, and she had not seen it coming until this moment. "Mrs. Patton," Holt said, without looking away from Clara, "this is your establishment. I believe you have the right." Mrs. Patton made a soft, distressed sound. She was a good woman. Clara knew that, believed it. But she was also 61 years old and alone, and every piece of property she owned existed at Gerald Holt's financial mercy, and everyone in the room knew it. "Clara," Mrs. Patton said, and her voice was barely a whisper, "I'm so sorry." They found the watch. It was in Clara's carpet bag, tucked beneath her folded spare dress, wrapped in a square of plain cloth. Holt's unnamed man produced it with the careful precision of someone who had placed it there himself, and Clara watched it come out of her bag and felt the world go sideways. "That's not possible," she heard herself say. Nobody in the room was looking at her anymore. Holt's lawyer, Creech, said something quiet to Mrs. Patton, and Mrs. Patton said something even quieter back, and none of it was addressed to Clara at all. She had become, in the space of about 90 seconds, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to. "I want to be very clear," Holt said to the room rather than to her, "that I have no interest in involving the sheriff in this matter. I think we'd all prefer to handle it quietly." He picked up the watch, turned it over once in his fingers, and tucked it into his pocket. "All I ask is that Miss Whitmore remove herself from this establishment by noon." "I didn't take it," Clara said again. Her voice came out harder this time. Holt finally looked at her. His expression was almost kind, which was worse than contempt would have been. "I think," he said quietly, "that we both know the conversation we had 2 weeks ago, and I think we both understand why I'd rather not make this a legal matter." He let that settle for a moment. "This can end quietly, or it can end loudly. That choice is yours." It was perfect. She saw the whole construction of it in that moment, laid out with the cold elegance of genuine malice. If she said nothing about his offer, she was a thief who left without protest. If she told people what he'd proposed to her, she was a thief who was also trying to destroy the reputation of a respectable man. Either way, she was the woman with no property, no family, and no standing. He was Gerald Holt. There was no version of this she could win inside these 4 walls. She went upstairs. She packed her carpet bag. Her hands were not shaking this time. It was the walk down the stairs that broke something open in her. Not the packing. She'd done that in a kind of cold, mechanical fury, folding her dresses with precise corners, tucking her thimble into the small inside pocket, not letting herself think past the next immediate action. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped out through Patton's front door into the full blaze of the July afternoon, she understood that there was nowhere to go. The street was busy. That was the thing about Redstone at noon. It was always busy. The boardwalks crowded with ranchers and tradespeople and women with shopping baskets, the road thick with wagon dust and horse traffic, and the general noise of a town that had grown faster than anyone had quite intended. Every single person stopped, not all at once, and not with any coordination, but in the way of small communities where information moves faster than sound. A ripple of awareness spreading out from Patton's door, heads turning, conversations dropping mid-sentence. Clara stood on the step with her carpet bag in her hand and felt 36 pairs of eyes settle on her like a physical weight. Behind her, Holt came out onto the boardwalk. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Clara made herself walk. She had no destination. She knew that and forced herself not to think about it, because the moment she allowed herself to fully reckon with the reality of her situation, alone, publicly accused, with perhaps $4 and some change in her purse and nowhere to sleep that night, she would fall apart, and she absolutely could not fall apart on this street in front of these people. She walked past the feed store, past the barber, past the land office where Mr. Simmons was standing in his doorway with his unfinished trousers on and an expression of uncomfortable pity on his face. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody called out. Nobody stepped forward. She had lived in this town for 11 months. She had sewn curtains and mended shirts and carried water for a woman whose hand shook. She had been courteous and quiet and careful and useful. And now she was walking down the middle of Redstone's main street with everything she owned in one bag, and the silence of the people around her was the loudest sound she'd ever heard. She reached the edge of the boardwalk at the end of the block, where the wood gave way to packed dirt, and the street narrowed toward the livery at the far end of town. She stopped there, because there was no logical next step. Beyond the livery was the road, and the road went to other towns that didn't know her, and that was the entirety of her plan. She was standing there staring at the road when she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss?" She turned. The man standing a few feet away was someone she'd seen before but never spoken to. One of those people who exist at the edges of a town's social fabric without being fully part of it. He came in for supplies occasionally, she thought. He wasn't from Redstone proper. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, with the lean, weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors in conditions that weren't gentle. His hat was plain and showed its age, the brim bent from use rather than fashion. He had several days of dark growth on his jaw, and his clothes were clean but worn at the elbows and knees. He was holding his hat in both hands, which she would later realize was not a habitual gesture. He was uncomfortable, and the hat gave his hand something to do. His eyes were gray-brown, the color of creek water in winter, and they were looking at her with an expression she hadn't encountered once in the past hour. He appeared to be trying to figure out what was actually useful rather than what was polite. "I don't mean to intrude," he said. He had a voice that matched the rest of him, quiet, economical, not given to decoration. "I heard what happened in there. Then you know I didn't take anything," Clara said, and immediately wished she'd said something less desperate sounding. He didn't flinch at her tone. "I know Gerald Holt," he said simply. "That's enough for me." She looked at him more carefully. "You're the rancher, Red Hollow, out past the creek." "Wade Mercer." He didn't offer his hand, which she appreciated. She was not in a state for formalities. "I've got a ranch hand position open, room and board included, separate quarters off the main house. It's hard work and the pay's not much." He paused. "But it's an honest arrangement. You'd have your own space. I wouldn't bother you." Clara stared at him. "You don't know me." "No?" He agreed with that without apology. "But I watched you walk down that street and I didn't see a thief. And I know what Holt is." He turned his hat over once in his hands. "That's the whole offer. You don't have to take it." The pragmatic part of her brain, the part that had gotten her this far, was already calculating. $4. Nowhere to sleep. A public accusation that would follow her to every boarding house in town. A road that led somewhere, but not anywhere specific. She looked at Wade Mercer's plain, tired, honest face. "What kind of work?" she said. "Everything," he said without hesitation. "Ranch like mine doesn't have the luxury of specialization. Garden, livestock, house, whatever needs doing. I can do that. I figured. She looked back at the road once, then at him. All right, Mr. Mercer. Wade, he said. All right, Wade. His wagon was behind the livery, an old rig with a bay mare that had seen better decades, and a wagon bed that held 2 sacks of flour, a coil of new rope, and what appeared to be a broken fence post he'd brought to town to use as a model for replacement. Clara put her carpet bag in the bed and climbed up to the seat without waiting for assistance. Wade came around to his side and climbed up after, and they pulled out of the livery lane and onto the main road without ceremony. As they passed the center of town, Clara sat straight-backed and looked forward, refusing the instinct to look at anyone watching from the boardwalk. She heard very clearly a woman's voice say something she couldn't quite make out, and then a lower voice answering. She kept her eyes on the road. They rode in silence for almost a mile before Wade said anything. I should tell you the place is not in great shape, he said, his eyes on the horse. All right, I've been... He stopped, started over. My wife passed 2 years ago. I haven't been keeping up with things the way I should. Clara looked at him sideways. His jaw was set, and he was watching the horse with more attention than the horse strictly required. She understood that he was telling her something necessary, and that it was costing him something to say it. I'm sorry, she said. The garden's gone entirely. The inside of the house is... He made a small, vague gesture with one hand. It's livable, but only just. I've dealt with worse than neglect, Clara said. He glanced at her then, a quick look, assessing rather than social. Whatever he saw seemed to settle something in him, and he turned back to the road. The ranch hands sleep in the bunkhouse, he said. There are 2 of them, Billy Crane, who's been with me since before my wife died, and a new man named Santos. Good workers. They'll leave you alone. Another pause. There's a small room off the back of the kitchen. Used to be a pantry. It has a proper door with a latch. That's fine. I'll pay you. He named a figure that was modest but fair, slightly more than what she'd been making from the household sewing work. That's acceptable, Clara said. Silence settled back between them. It was not, Clara noticed, an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of 2 people who were both accustomed to their own company and didn't feel obligated to fill air with words just to prove they were present. The road curved south and east, following the dry creek bed through stands of mesquite. Saguaro. The heat had not let up at all. If anything, it was denser out here away from town, the air shimmering in visible waves off the pale dirt, but Clara found that being in motion made it easier to bear. There was something about sitting still in that moment that would have been unbearable. After a while, she said, Holt is going to be angry that you gave me a way out. Probably, Wade said. That might cause you trouble. He was quiet for a moment. Holt's been causing me trouble for 3 years, he said. Water rights. He's been trying to get me to sell the South Range for the water access. I won't. He paused. Him being angry at me is not a new condition. Clara absorbed this. So this wasn't entirely an act of charity. He looked at her again, and this time there was something almost like surprise in his expression, as if he hadn't expected her to arrive there so quickly. No, he said honestly. It wasn't entirely that. She found she respected the honesty more than a protest of pure generosity would have earned. That's all right, she said. I'd rather know what I'm walking into. You'd rather know most things, I expect, he said. And it wasn't a criticism. It was just an observation, stated plainly, like something he'd noticed and was reporting accurately. Yes, she agreed. I would. Red Hollow Ranch revealed itself slowly, the way things in the desert did. First as a smudge of darker color on the pale horizon, then as shapes, then as specific structures with specific problems visible from a quarter-mile out. The main house was adobe brick, low and square, with a covered porch running along the front. It had been a solid house once, and probably still was in terms of structure, but the roof of the porch was sagging on the left side, and 2 of the support posts had developed alarming leans. The garden space to the south side of the house was a tangle of dead plants and cracked earth, with the ghost of an irrigation channel visible in the dry ground. The chicken coop at the far edge of the yard was still standing, but the wire fencing had developed gaps. The bunkhouse was in better shape. Men who had to sleep somewhere kept their sleeping quarters functional as a matter of basic self-interest. Beyond it, Claire could see the barn and corral and the flash of movement that meant cattle somewhere in the far pasture. It was not a prosperous operation, but it was not, she thought, a hopeless one either. The bones were there. Wade pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. He climbed down and came around to her side, but she had already dropped to the ground by the time he arrived, and he stopped and accepted this without comment. "I'll show you the room," he said. The inside of the house hit her in a quiet way that she didn't show on her face. It was dark, and it smelled of dust and disuse. Not filth exactly, but the specific emptiness of a space that nobody had tended with any care for a long time. The front room had a stone fireplace and a table and 2 chairs and a sideboard, and there was a layer of fine red dust on every horizontal surface. The kitchen beyond it was functional but joyless, the kind of space where someone had been preparing food for survival without any thought for the room itself. There was a woman's presence that had been there once and was now conspicuously absent, a curtain rod over the kitchen window with no curtain on it, a hook beside the back door where an apron might have hung, a small wooden box on the windowsill that might have held something living once. Wade led her through the kitchen to the door at the back. The room beyond was indeed small. It had been a pantry, as he said, and the shelves were still built into one wall, but there was a window on the east wall and a proper plank floor, and the door had a solid wooden latch. "I can get a mattress from the barn," Wade said. "There's a spare frame. I'll manage tonight," Clara said. "Tomorrow's soon enough for the mattress." He looked around the room as if trying to see it fresh. "I know it's not much." "Mr. Mercer." She waited until he met her eyes. "Wade, I am standing in a room with 4 solid walls, a door that latches, and a window. After today, that is not nothing." He looked at her for a moment in that same direct assessing way he'd looked at her in Redstone. Then he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "All right," he said. He left her there. Clara heard his footsteps cross the kitchen, heard the back door open and close. She set her carpet bag on the floor and looked at the room. Outside the small window, the sun was beginning to drop toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of copper and rust. The shadows stretched long and purple across the yard. She sat down on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit, and she let herself feel what she had not allowed herself to feel all afternoon, the cold, sick shame of standing on that street with her bag in her hand while 3 dozen people watched and said nothing. The helpless fury at the watch appearing from her carpet bag with the smooth efficiency of planted evidence, the particular humiliation of having no recourse, of being exactly vulnerable enough that the cruelty landed clean. She let herself feel all of it for about 5 minutes. She had found, over the years, that this was the right amount of time, long enough to acknowledge what was real, short enough not to drown in it. Then she got up, opened her carpet bag, and took out her silver thimble. She set it on the window ledge, where the last light could catch it. It was the only thing her mother had left her. She had carried it across the territory and through 11 months of careful, quiet survival, and she was not going to let Gerald Holt take from her the ability to move forward. She rolled up her sleeves and went to find a broom. She found Billy Crane first. He was sitting on the steps of the bunkhouse, working on a piece of leather harness with a punch and an awl, a man of about 50 with a weathered face, completely white hair under a battered hat, and the permanently squinting eyes of someone who had spent decades looking into western sun. He watched her come across the yard carrying what she'd found, a broom, a bucket, and a rag, without any particular expression. "You're the new woman," he said. Not unkindly, just stating a fact. "Clara Whitmore, Billy Crane." He didn't get up, which she respected. A man in the middle of leather work didn't stop for social conventions. "You from Redstone?" "I was." He nodded slowly, continuing to punch holes in the leather with steady, practiced pressure. "I heard a little of what happened. Town gossip travels fast on the road." He glanced up at her. "For what it's worth, Miss Whitmore, I've known Gerald Holt for better than 10 years. He's the kind of man who keeps things in his pocket that don't belong there." Clara looked at him carefully. "Thank you for saying that." "Don't thank me. Just telling you what I know." He returned to his work. "Wade's a fair man. Doesn't ask more than he gives. You'll be fine here as long as you pull your weight, which you look like the kind of woman who does." "I intend to." Santos she met an hour later when he came in from the far pasture with a fence problem that required Billy's consultation. A younger man, maybe 25, with a quick, watchful quality to him, and a manner that was polite but reserved. He tipped his hat to her, said, "Ma'am," and turned his attention back to the fence problem without making anything of her presence. She appreciated his economy on the matter. She spent the rest of the evening cleaning her room. She swept every inch of the floor twice, scraped the dust from the window ledge, and scrubbed the built-in shelves with the bucket of water she'd pumped from the well. The work was physical and specific, and demanded her full attention, which was what she needed. By the time the light through the window went fully dark, the room smelled of damp, clean wood instead of dust and old air, and she had made up a sleeping arrangement on the floor from her spare dress and the blanket she found folded on the pantry shelf, left behind from who knew when, slightly moth-eaten at one corner, but clean enough. She heard Wade moving around in the kitchen for a while, heard the sounds of a meal being prepared, the clank of an iron pot, the sound of water being pumped, the particular smell of salt pork frying that drifted under her door. Then a knock. "I made food," he said through the door. "If you want it." She opened the door. He was standing in the kitchen with 2 plates on the table, each with salt pork and cornbread and a pile of canned beans. It was plain food, and there was nothing ceremonial about the way it was set out, and she was more grateful for that than she would have been for anything elaborate. "Thank you," she said. They ate at the kitchen table across from each other. He ate with the focused efficiency of a man who thought of meals as fuel rather than experience. She was hungry enough to do the same. After a while, he said, "The garden's been dead since last year. I couldn't—" He stopped. "I kept meaning to replant. Didn't get to it." "I can start on it," Clara said, "if that's useful. The soil's still all right out there. Just needs water and work." "I can do that." He looked at his plate. "The curtains in the front room. My wife made those. They're—" He stopped again. She noticed he did this, started sentences and then reconsidered what he'd meant to say and came out somewhere different than he'd started. "I kept them down. Couldn't figure out what to do with them." "You don't have to do anything with them," Clara said. "They can stay where they are." "I might put them back up," he said. "Sometime." "All right." He nodded at his plate. That was the end of that conversation. But something in the room had shifted slightly. A degree or two. The way a door moves when you put your shoulder against it, not open but no longer completely sealed. She lay on her floor that night and stared at the ceiling of the room that had been a pantry and listened to the sounds of a working ranch going quiet around her. The horses moving in the barn, a coyote somewhere out in the dark, the particular silence of the desert at night that wasn't really silence at all, but a different kind of sound. She thought about the moment Holt's man had pulled the watch from her bag, the smooth cloth it was wrapped in, the way the man's hand had known exactly where to reach. He had done this before, she was certain of it. A man who constructed something that precise had constructed things like it before. She was not the first woman who had said no and found herself holding consequences that weren't hers. She thought about the street, the people watching. Mr. Simmons in his doorway with his almost finished trousers and his uncomfortable pity. She thought about walking down that street with her bag, one foot in front of the other, not letting herself stop. And then she thought about a man holding his hat in both hands outside a livery, looking at her with creekwater eyes and saying, "I know Gerald Holt. That's enough for me." She had spent 11 months being careful and quiet and useful and invisible. She had built nothing that counted. She had left no mark. She had tried to take up as little space as possible because, in her experience, women who took up space in the Arizona Territory in 1882 generally paid for it. But careful and small hadn't protected her. She had been careful and small, and Gerald Holt had destroyed her in 60 seconds anyway. Clara looked at the ceiling. She listened to the coyote, closer now, its voice thin and rising in the dark. She was going to have to build something real, something that couldn't be knocked over with a planted watch and a crowd of silent witnesses. She didn't know what that looked like yet. She didn't know how it ended. She only knew that she was 26 years old, with a silver thimble on a window ledge, and a carpet bag in a room that was clean now because she had cleaned it, and that was one true thing in a day full of wreckage. She closed her eyes. The coyote called once more, and then went quiet. Outside, the desert stretched enormous and indifferent to the north, the south, and the east, the Redstone Road fading into darkness, and Gerald Holt's gold watch chain glinting somewhere in his pocket, in the lamp-lit parlor of a town that had watched a woman walk away and said nothing. The ranch settled around her. Clara slept. She was up before the sun. Not because anyone told her to be and not to prove anything, just because lying awake in the dark listening to her own thoughts had gotten old around 4 in the morning, and the alternative was to get up and do something with her hands. Clara had always been this way. Her mother used to say she'd been born impatient with stillness. The kitchen was cold and dark when she pushed open the pantry door. She found the lamp on the shelf by the stove, lit it, and stood for a moment in the low yellow light, looking at the room properly for the first time. Last night she'd eaten in it without really seeing it. Now she saw it the way you see a problem you're going to have to solve. The stove itself was sound, cast iron, heavy, old but serviceable. The problem was everything around it. The shelf above held an assortment of tins and crocks with no apparent logic to their arrangement, some empty, some with contents she couldn't identify without opening them. The table had developed a tilt from an uneven floor plank that would drive a person slowly insane over the course of months. 2 of the 4 chairs had loose joints. The window above the wash basin faced east, which was good, morning light, but was so filmed with dust and grease that almost none of it was getting through. Clara pushed her sleeves up and went to work. She didn't attack the whole kitchen at once. She started with the stove, because you needed the stove to make coffee, and coffee came before everything else. She cleared the ash from the firebox, found the wood box was low but not empty, and had a fire going in about 10 minutes. Then she stood at the window with a rag and cleaned it in sections, pressing hard into the corners where the grime had built up thickest, until the glass went from opaque to merely dirty to actually transparent. The light that came through when she was done was modest and gray. Pre-dawn, the sky outside still more purple than blue, but it was real light, and the kitchen looked different in it, more like a room someone might actually want to be in. She was grinding coffee beans when she heard Wade's boots on the floor above. He came downstairs to find her at the stove with coffee already made, the table wiped down, and a pan of cornmeal mush warming on the back burner. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of this for a moment without speaking. "The window," he said finally. "It needed doing." He came to the table and sat down. He looked like a man who had not slept particularly well, which she suspected was his normal condition rather than anything specific to last night. There were shadows under his eyes that had the quality of permanence. "You don't have to cook," he said. "That wasn't part of what I offered. I was already up. It didn't make sense to make enough for one." She set a cup of coffee in front of him. "I'll tell you when something is and isn't working for me. I don't need you to protect me from the possibility that I might do something unnecessary." He looked at the coffee, then up at her. "Fair enough," he said. That was the thing about Wade Mercer that Clara would come to understand over the following weeks. He didn't argue when he didn't have grounds to. A lot of men would have pushed back on that, would have said something about being the one who made the arrangements, or redirected the conversation to remind her where the power in the arrangement sat. Wade just said fair enough and drank his coffee, and that small thing told her more about him than an hour of polished talk would have. The first week was almost purely about learning the shape of the work. The ranch ran cattle primarily, a herd of about 60 head out on the South Range, which Billy and Santos managed between them. But there was also a small flock of chickens for eggs, 2 milk cows, the draft horse that pulled the wagon, and Wade's own riding horse, a tough gray quarter horse he called Bishop. The garden space, as he'd said, was dead, but Clara walked it carefully on that second morning and crouched down to dig her fingers into the soil, and found it wasn't as far gone as it looked. Dry, compacted, robbed of nutrients from the years of neglect, but not dead underneath. The clay layer was deeper than she'd expected, which meant it held moisture better than the surface suggested. "What was planted here before?" she asked Wade that evening. He thought about it. "Tomatoes, squash, beans." Ruth had a section she kept for herbs. He said his wife's name the way people say names that still hurt, not with obvious emotion, but with a careful flatness that was its own kind of acknowledgement. "I'll need seeds, and a way to get water to it without hauling buckets all day. There's an irrigation channel. It's silted up, but the structure's still there. Can it be cleared? Probably. Then that's worth doing before I plant anything." He nodded. He didn't offer to help, and she didn't ask, because she was still at the stage of figuring out the divisions, what he did, what she did, where those things overlapped, and where they didn't. She was also still at the stage of being quietly, constantly aware that she was a woman alone on a ranch in the Arizona desert, with a man she'd known for less than a week, and that the sole guarantee of her safety was her own read of his character, which she was still taking the measure of. He never came near the pantry room. He knocked if he needed to speak to her through the door. When she was in the kitchen or the main room, he moved around her with a kind of careful spatial awareness, never crowding, never finding reasons to stand close. It wasn't coldness. It was more like, she searched for the right word, consideration. As if he was aware that the arrangement required her to trust him, and that trust had to be earned rather than assumed. She watched this, and she noted it, and she filed it away. The irrigation channel took 4 days to clear, working in the early morning before the heat peaked, and again in the late afternoon when it dropped. She did most of it herself, with a spade and a lot of physical patience. But on the third day, Santos appeared beside her without comment or preamble and started working the far end. They didn't talk much while they worked. Santos had a quiet efficiency about him that she respected, and by the time they finished on the fourth evening, the channel was running clean again, and she had a clearer understanding of why he kept his counsel. His English was good but came carefully, and he seemed to prefer to let work speak ahead of words. "Thank you," she said when they were done, both of them sweaty and red-dusted and tired. "It needed doing," he said, with a small shrug that echoed, without intending to, what she'd said to Wade about the kitchen window. She smiled at that. He almost smiled back. She started seeds in the kitchen window 3 days after clearing the channel. Tomatoes, squash, 2 kinds of beans. Planted them in cracked clay pots she found in the barn, filled with soil she'd amended with ash from the stove and the composted matter she'd been collecting from the kitchen scraps. It was small work, patient work, the kind of work that required you to accept you wouldn't see results for weeks, and that most of the outcome was outside your control. She'd always been decent at that kind of patience when it was for something she cared about. Wade found her at the kitchen window with dirt on her hands and a row of planted pots on the sill one morning before breakfast. He stood in the doorway looking at them for a moment. "I didn't say you couldn't," he said. He stopped. Started differently. "Ruth used to grow things in here in the winter, before the garden." "I know it's your house," Clara said, without turning around. "If you'd rather I didn't—" "No." The word came out more quickly than his usual measured pace. "No, I don't mind. He seemed to search for what he actually wanted to say. "It looks better. The window, with something in it." She turned then. He was already looking away toward the stove, and she could tell that had cost him something. Not embarrassment exactly, but the discomfort of someone who had said something true and wasn't sure yet whether that had been the right call. "I'll make breakfast," she said. "All right," he said. And that was how those weeks went, in small moments, small admissions, small adjustments. The house did not transform dramatically or quickly. Things improved the way weather changes, gradually, and then suddenly you noticed it was different than it had been. She rehung the curtains in the front room, not because she had to, and not without thinking carefully about it first. They were his wife's curtains, and the decision about what to do with them was fundamentally his. But one evening she found them folded on the table with a note in Wade's plain, practical handwriting. "If you want to put these back up, the hardware's still in the wall." That was all it said. She read it twice, then put the curtains up the following morning and smoothed them straight, and didn't mention it. He didn't mention it either. But she noticed him glance at them that evening when he came in, and the expression that crossed his face in that unguarded moment was complicated and quiet and private, and she looked away from it. It was somewhere around the 4th week that she noticed the change in him at meals. In the beginning, he'd eaten with the same focused efficiency she'd observed on her first night. Head slightly down, food gone without much ceremony, up and out within 10 minutes. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, meals had begun to last a little longer. Not because the food had changed, though she was cooking better than he had been, but because conversation had begun to develop. Small things at first, the state of the south fence, the price of cattle at the last market, a problem with the well pulley. Practical subjects, nothing personal. But one evening, about a month in, he said out of nowhere, "How did you end up in Redstone?" Clara looked up from her plate. "My mother was in Tucson. She died in November. After that, there wasn't a reason to stay." "You don't have family anywhere else?" "A brother in Ohio. We don't speak." She paused. He didn't think much of how I chose to live, which is to say he thought I should marry someone he approved of and stop having opinions. Something in Wade's expression shifted. Not quite amusement, but close to it. And you didn't. I did not. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, Ruth was from New Mexico. Her family had a ranch near Socorro. She came to Arizona because her cousin was here, and she met me at a dance in Redstone and told me afterward that she'd thought I was the most boring man at the party. Clara blinked. She told you that? She said she appreciated that I wasn't performing for anyone, that I was just standing there being exactly what I was. He looked at his coffee. She said that was rare enough to be interesting. She was right, Clara said, and then wondered if she'd said too much. Wade looked at her, not the quick assessing look she was used to, but something slower and less defended. Then he looked back at his coffee. She was usually right, he said. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted in the room, in the same way it had shifted with the curtains. Not dramatically, not irreversibly, just a degree or two further open. She was 4 weeks into the work when the first serious problem announced itself. She'd been in the garden. The seedlings were in the ground now, small and tentative in the cleared beds, when Billy came across the yard at a faster pace than his usual easy walk. Buyer pulled out, he said. The Creech contract, the one for 30 head. Clara straightened up. When? Word came this morning. No reason given. Billy's jaw was tight. Santos heard in town that Creech has been told not to buy from us. She already knew the shape of it before Billy finished the sentence. Creech was Holt's lawyer, the man who had stood behind him in Patton's hallway with his careful, expensive suit and his witness's posture. Of course, she went inside and found Wade at the kitchen table with the contract papers in front of him, a look on his face that she recognized. Not panic, but the tight, controlled expression of a man doing rapid calculations and not liking the results. How much does it matter? She asked, sitting down across from him. 30 head was a third of the season's income. He didn't sugarcoat it. We can find another buyer, but it'll take time, and Creech had a good price. He set the papers down. This is Holt. Yes. He looked at her. I figured when I brought you here that he'd push back. I figured it would be about me. He paused. I didn't think he'd move this fast. He knows what he's doing, Claire said. He's done it before. He doesn't get angry. He gets organized. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm not sorry I brought you here. I didn't ask you to be. I know you didn't. I'm telling you anyway. He picked up the papers again and looked at them with a grim focus. I'll find another buyer. We've got time before the season's out. She watched him and thought about what he wasn't saying, that 3 years of Holt pushing on the water rights had already thinned the margins, and losing this contract was a pressure that landed on top of other pressures. She also thought about what she could and couldn't offer. She could work. She could plan. She could be relentlessly practical. She could not, from the spare room off the kitchen, fix the fact that Gerald Holt had long reach and longer patience. But she had learned something in a month of living at Red Hollow about what stubbornness could build. She went back out to the garden. She checked each seedling. She repaired a section of irrigation channel that had silted slightly at the curve near the south bed. She pulled weeds for an hour in the full heat of the afternoon sun, her hat tilted against the worst of it, her hands working steadily in the warm red earth. Billy came to find her before supper, stood at the edge of the garden beds with his hat in his hands, and watched her work for a moment. You're going to stay, aren't you? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Clara sat back on her heels and looked up at him. Did you think I wasn't? He shrugged one shoulder. Some people, when the situation gets complicated, they reassess. I reassessed on day 1, Clara said. I knew it was complicated. I stayed anyway. She turned back to the soil. This garden's going to come in by August. I'm not leaving before I see that. Billy put his hat back on and looked out at the rows of small green shoots in the cleared beds, the irrigation channel running clean alongside them, the kitchen window visible through the late afternoon light with its row of clay pots on the sill. No, he said, with a tone that wasn't quite approval but was something adjacent to it. I didn't figure you would. He walked back toward the bunkhouse. The sun dropped another degree toward the mountains. Clara kept working, her hands in the dirt, the ranch settling into its evening sounds around her. The whole broken, complicated place gradually, imperfectly, stubbornly knitting itself back together. The tomatoes came in the first week of August, small and improbable and deeply red, and Clara stood in the garden that morning looking at them with a satisfaction that was almost embarrassing in its intensity. They were just tomatoes. But they were tomatoes that had come out of dead soil that she had cleared and amended and watered through 6 weeks of punishing heat, and they were real, and they were hers in the way that work makes things yours regardless of who owns the land. She picked a bowlful and brought them inside, and Wade looked at them on the kitchen table with an expression she'd learned to read by now. That slight softening around the eyes that was as close as he generally got to open enthusiasm. "That's something," he said. "There'll be more by next week." She set the bowl between them. "The squash is almost ready, too." He picked up a tomato and turned it in his fingers. Ruth never got them to come in before September. "Different soil preparation," Clara said, and then immediately wondered if that had been the wrong thing to say. Too much like comparison, too close to territory she hadn't earned. But Wade just nodded, the way he did when information was useful, and bit into the tomato over the sink to avoid the juice, and said, "That's good," with the straightforward conviction of a man who meant it. She had been at Red Hollow for 2 months by then, long enough for the rhythms of the place to feel familiar. The pre-dawn start, the particular sounds of the horses in the early morning, Billy's habit of appearing for coffee exactly 15 minutes after she had it ready, as if he could smell it from the bunkhouse at a fixed distance. Long enough for the work itself to have developed its own shape, mornings in the garden or the house, afternoons on whatever the ranch most needed, evenings that had gradually migrated from solitary to shared without either of them quite deciding it. The supply run to Redstone had been coming for 2 weeks, and they both knew it. The ranch needed things she couldn't grow or improvise. Salt, lamp oil, a replacement part for the pump mechanism that had been threatening to fail since June, 2 specific medicines that Billy needed for a recurring chest condition. Wade had been putting it off in the same way you put off a conversation you know is necessary but unpleasant, and Clara had let him because she understood the hesitation. Redstone was the town that had thrown her into the street. Walking back into it was not nothing, but you couldn't run a working ranch on what you had on hand forever. "I'll go with you," she said one evening when he finally put the list on the table. Wade looked up from it. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She sat down across from him. "But I'm not going to hide from Redstone for the rest of my life." "I didn't do anything wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "It might not be comfortable." "Wade." She met his eyes. "I walked down that street with my bag in my hand in front of 3 dozen people. I already know what uncomfortable looks like." He held her gaze for a moment, then, "All right." They left before full light, as they always did on supply runs, to cover the road in the cooler part of the morning. Clara wore her better dress, not because she was trying to perform anything, but because she had thought about it and decided that walking into Redstone looking like she was trying to disappear was not who she wanted to be. She sat straight on the wagon seat and watched the desert come light around them. And she did not talk much on the road, and neither did Wade, and the silence was the kind they had both gotten comfortable in. The town looked the same. She'd expected it to look different somehow, the way places you've experienced trauma look different in memory than in reality. But Redstone in August was simply Redstone, dusty and loud and occupied with its own business. The boardwalks busy by 8 in the morning, the smell of the bakery on Main Street mixing with horse and hay, and the particular dry dust smell of an Arizona town that needed rain. People noticed her. She registered it the way you register weather, a fact of conditions, not something you could argue with. Eyes finding her and then cutting away. A pause in a conversation on the boardwalk. Mrs. Darcy from the dressmaker's shop looking up from her window and then back down very quickly. Clara kept walking. Wade walked beside her, not touching her, not doing anything demonstrative, but there. His presence had a quality she'd noticed before, a kind of physical steadiness, like he had enough weight to him that things didn't knock him off his line. Walking beside him, she found her own spine straightened without her consciously deciding to make it. They were coming out of the hardware store with the pump part when she heard Holt's voice. He was across the street, which meant he'd either seen them from a window or had been watching for them, and neither option felt like coincidence. He was with 2 men she didn't recognize. Not his usual crew, not Creech, but men with the particular look of people who were paid to be present rather than useful. "Miss Whitmore." He crossed the street without hurrying because hurrying was never Gerald Holt's manner. "Or are we using Mercer now?" The people on the boardwalk went still in the specific way of people who can smell a confrontation building and haven't decided yet whether to walk away or watch. "Mr. Holt," Clara said, "I heard you'd taken up housekeeping at Red Hollow." He smiled, the kind of smile that had nothing warm in it. "I have to say, I'm not surprised. A woman in your position can't afford to be too selective." Wade had gone very still beside her. "A woman in my position," Clara said, "is standing on a public street in a town where the people who watched me be lied about 2 months ago are starting to remember what they actually saw." She let that sit for 1 second. "I didn't take your watch, Mr. Holt. You know I didn't. Everyone on this street who's listening right now is going to spend the rest of the day thinking about what that means." Holt's smile didn't leave his face, but it changed quality. Strong words for a woman whose employer just lost his Creech contract. "That's enough." Wade's voice was quiet, which made it carry farther than it would have if he'd raised it. He took 1 step forward, not toward Holt, just forward, so that he was fully visible and fully present. "You want to talk business, Holt? You come to the ranch and we talk business. You want to threaten a woman on a public street? You do it knowing that I'm going to tell every buyer, every hand, and every rancher in this territory exactly what I saw today." He paused. "Your choice on which one this is." Holt looked at him. Something passed through his expression. Calculation, assessment, the measurement of a man deciding whether to push now or push later. He was not afraid of Wade Mercer, but he was a man who was careful about his public image, and the boardwalk had accumulated an audience. "We'll settle things in time," Holt said, with the deliberate ease of someone performing confidence rather than feeling it. He looked at Clara once more, and what was in that look was not anger, but something uglier. The specific contempt of a man who has decided that a woman refusing him is a problem to be solved rather than a decision to be respected. Then he walked away. The crowd on the boardwalk exhaled. Nobody said anything directly to Clara or Wade, but a woman Clara barely knew, the wife of the land office clerk, caught her eye as they passed and gave her a single, small, firm nod. It was nothing dramatic. It was also not nothing. In the wagon on the way home, Wade didn't speak for the first several miles. Clara let him have the silence because she could tell he was processing something, not shutting her out. Finally, he said, "He's not going to stop." No, she agreed. "He's going to keep pulling at the business until something gives." "I know." He turned the reins in his hands. "I've been thinking about the South Range. If I let it go, the water rights dispute would be settled and Holt would have what he's been after for 3 years. The ranch would still be viable without it, technically." He paused. "But it would be smaller. And giving it to him feels—" He stopped. "Like letting him win," Clara said. "Not just that." He thought about it. "Like proving to him that pushing people hard enough gets him what he wants. Which means he does it to the next person." She looked at his profile. The set jaw. The eyes on the road. The way he held difficulty in his body without performing it. She had thought, in the first weeks, that he was a closed man. She understood now that he wasn't closed. He was just careful. There was a distinction, and it mattered. "What if there was a way to go around him?" she said. He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Holt's power is in controlling the local buyers. Creech, the merchants who depend on him, the water rights that make him necessary to people in this valley." She'd been turning this over for weeks since the Creech contract had fallen through. "But that's only local. What about Maricopa? Or the railroad buyers? They don't have the same relationships with Holt. They buy from whoever has quality stock at a fair price." "I don't have connections in Maricopa. Not yet." She turned slightly on the seat. "Billy mentioned once that he knew a cattle agent out of Phoenix, a man named Garrett. He worked with him years ago." Wade was quiet, thinking. "Garrett charges a finder's fee, which is less than what we're losing by selling to Holt's controlled buyers at suppressed prices." She'd done the rough arithmetic. "And it opens buyers that he can't reach." He didn't answer immediately, which she'd learned meant he was taking the idea seriously rather than dismissing it. A man who argued back fast was often a man who'd already decided. Wade's silences were where his actual thinking happened. "I'd have to talk to Billy," he said, finally. "I know. And it would take time to establish. This season's difficult," she said. "I'm not talking about this season. I'm talking about next year." She met his eyes when he looked at her. We're not leaving, Wade. So it makes sense to plan for the years after this one. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, just that degree or two shift she'd seen before. The door moving slightly further on its hinges. No, he said quietly, we're not leaving. The conversation with Billy happened 3 days later, and Billy, as it turned out, still had Garrett's address from a letter 3 years old, which was a starting point. Wade wrote a letter that week. The wheels of the plan were slow turning and uncertain and not guaranteed to amount to anything, but they were turning, and that was more than they'd had before. What happened 3 weeks after that was not something either of them planned or discussed or arrived at through any logical sequence of events. It was something that built the way weather builds, out of small accumulating pressures that become, suddenly, a single undeniable condition. It was an evening in late September. The heat had finally begun to break. Not cool, not even close to cool, but the particular edge had softened and the nights were dropping to temperatures that made sleeping possible again. Claire had made supper and they'd eaten, and she was washing up while Wade sat at the table working through a column of figures that had to do with the fall inventory. The lamp was lit. Outside, the first insects of early autumn were starting their evening noise in the brush beyond the garden. She had her hands in the wash basin when he said, without preamble, I want to ask you something. The way he said it, that slight change of register, the way a sentence sits differently in a room when it's carrying more weight than the words themselves, made her hands go still in the water. She turned around. He was looking at her from the table, the figures forgotten. His expression was the most open she had ever seen it, which paradoxically made him look more vulnerable rather than more readable, like a man who had decided to put something down that he'd been carrying at considerable effort. I want to ask you to marry me, he said. The room was very quiet. Wade, she started. I'm not asking because of Holt. He said it before she could think it. I know how it could look. I know the timing is, I know what it looks like, but that's not what this is. He paused, and she could see him searching for words with the same careful effort he brought to everything that actually mattered to him. I've been trying to figure out how to say this without it sounding like something it isn't. I'm not sure I can. She stood with her hands dripping and said nothing, because nothing was the only honest response until she understood what she was actually being asked. I know it started as a practical arrangement, he said, and it was an arrangement. I don't want to pretend otherwise, but somewhere between, he stopped, started differently. You told me once you didn't need me to protect you from the possibility that you might do something unnecessary, and I've thought about that probably more than I should have. He turned the pen over in his fingers. I'm not asking to protect you, or because I need help with the business. I'm asking because I would rather have you here than not. Because this house is a different place than it was, and not because you cleaned it, because of, he gestured, a slightly frustrated movement, the gesture of a man who is not a verbal person trying to do a verbal thing. Because of you. She looked at him for a long moment. She was scared. She was honest enough with herself to know that, and honest enough not to dress it up as anything more complicated. She had watched her mother's life bend and narrow around a man who hadn't deserved the bending. She had spent 11 months being careful and self-sufficient, and she was not romantic about what marriage meant for a woman in 1882. She had arrived at this ranch with a carpet bag and $4 and a bruise on her reputation that hadn't fully healed, and she knew that what Wade Mercer was offering her was real and decent and genuinely felt. She also knew, and had known for some weeks in the quiet, honest part of herself, that the way she felt sitting across this kitchen table was different from the way she'd felt sitting across any other table. I'm not easy to be with, she said. I have opinions, I argue, I don't defer well. I know, he said, with a complete absence of concern. And this situation with Holt is not going away, he agreed, married or not. I need to keep my own money. What I earn needs to be mine. He didn't even hesitate. That's fair. She looked at him sitting there with his pen in his hand and his column of figures, and his face that was showing her more of itself than it usually did. This man who had stepped out of a shadow and offered her a room and a decent arrangement and turned out, over 4 months of early mornings and difficult evenings and shared meals and one confrontation on a public street, to be exactly what he had appeared to be on the first day. Someone who was exactly what he was. All right, Wade, she said. He looked at her. All right? Yes. She turned back to the wash basin and put her hands back in the water because if she stood there looking at him, she would cry, and she was not going to do that. Yes, I'll marry you. She heard the small exhale of breath from the table behind her. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just the sound of a man who'd been holding something tightly, releasing it. They rode to the town of Millhaven, 2 hours southeast, on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later, with Billy in the wagon bed as witness because Wade had asked him the night before and Billy had said, "About time," with such complete matter-of-factness that they'd both laughed, which was not something that happened often enough. The courthouse in Millhaven was a square adobe building with a flagpole out front and a justice of the peace named Harlan, who had a cold he was clearly suffering through and who performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this several hundred times and had a handkerchief he needed to get back to. It was nothing like what ceremony was supposed to look like. There were no flowers, no guests beyond Billy, no particular acknowledgement from the universe that anything significant was occurring. Harlan read the words. They said what they were supposed to say. He signed the paper. She signed the paper. Harlan sneezed twice, apologized, and said congratulations with genuine but abbreviated warmth. And then Wade Mercer turned to her in the small dusty room and kissed her. He wasn't a man who did anything for performance, and the kiss was like him, quiet and real, and not trying to be more than it was. But his hand came up and held the side of her face with a gentleness that was so utterly unguarded, so completely undefended, that something in her chest cracked open in a way that wasn't painful. She hadn't expected gentleness from him. She'd known he was decent. She hadn't known he had that. On the ride back to Red Hollow, Billy pretended to sleep in the wagon bed with an unconvincingness that was almost certainly deliberate. The road ran through mesquite and scrub and afternoon light, and Wade held the reins in his left hand, and at some point his right hand found hers on the seat between them, not making anything of it, just there. She looked out at the desert rolling past and thought, this is not how I imagined any of this. The ranch came into view as it always did. Slowly at first, then all at once. The porch with its still slightly leaning left post that she kept meaning to fix. The garden, visible from the road now, green and stubborn in its long beds. The kitchen window with its pots of herbs along the sill, catching the last of the afternoon light. She had arrived at this place with nothing except what she refused to put down. She was leaving it as the same person, and also not, in the way of changes that happen in the spaces between the decisions you consciously make. The wagon pulled into the yard. Bishop nickered from the corral. Somewhere in the garden, the irrigation channel was running its slow, patient course through the earth she had cleared. Home, Clara thought. Not a word she'd used casually in a long time. Not a word she'd trusted. But there it was. The letter from Garrett arrived on a Thursday morning in October, 3 weeks after the wedding, and Wade read it twice at the kitchen table before sliding it across to Clara without a word. Garrett was interested, not committed. The letter was careful in the way of a businessman who had learned not to make promises before he'd seen the product, but interested enough to propose a visit to Red Hollow in November to assess the herd. He mentioned 2 railroad-adjacent buyers in Maricopa who were actively looking for reliable suppliers, and the numbers he named, even in approximation, were better than anything the ranch had seen in 3 years. Clara read it and set it down. He's cautious. He should be. He doesn't know us yet. Wade picked the letter back up and looked at it again. But this is real. It's real, she agreed. Something had changed between them since Millhaven, and she was still getting used to the shape of it. Not dramatically. They were both people who moved slowly through emotional territory, who distrusted anything that happened too fast. But the careful spatial distance of those first months had quietly dissolved, and in its place was something more like ease, though ease was perhaps too simple a word for what it actually was. It was more that they had stopped managing themselves around each other and started simply being there, which was different and harder to describe but unmistakable in practice. He still had nights where something closed down in him, where he sat on the porch after supper and stared out at the dark in a way that had nothing to do with the dark and everything to do with Ruth, and on those nights Clara left him to it. She'd learned that some grief wasn't an obstacle to love, it was just part of the person you loved, and trying to fix it was both presumptuous and futile. She'd make sure there was coffee in the morning and let the night be what it needed to be. He, for his part, had learned the particular silence she got when she was working through a problem. Not a withdrawn silence, but a thinking one, and had stopped interrupting it to ask if everything was all right. Everything was not always all right, but she always came out the other side with either a solution or a clearer understanding of the problem, and either way she'd tell him when she was ready. They were still figuring it out. That was the honest version, but they were figuring it out in the same direction, which counted for more than either of them said out loud. The fire happened 11 days later. Clara smelled it before she saw it, that specific sharp smell of burning grass that is nothing like burning wood, that spreads faster than logic and lives in your memory once you've encountered it. She was in the kitchen in the early morning, before full light, when it reached her through the open window, and she was out the back door and into the yard before she'd quite decided to move. The south pasture was lit up along its eastern fence line. Not the whole of it, not yet, but the line of flame was moving with the pre-dawn wind at the kind of pace that turned manageable into catastrophic inside of 20 minutes. And the cattle in that pasture were already moving. She could hear them, the low, urgent sound of animals that know something is wrong before they can see what it is. She was already shouting for Wade and Billy as she ran to the barn for the water buckets. What followed was 3 hours that Clara would never be able to recount with any sequential clarity, because emergency doesn't work sequentially. It works in flashes of immediate action, each one consuming all available attention, the whole thing later assembling in memory like a series of photographs rather than a continuous film. Wade on Bishop cutting ahead of the herd to steer them away from the fence line. Billy and Santos hauling water from the creek in a relay that should have been impossible to maintain at that pace and somehow was. Clara and a ranch hand named Dove, who joined them 2 weeks earlier working the near edge of the fire with wet burlap sacks, beating at the flames in the dirt, the heat enormous and immediate and utterly indifferent to the effort being made against it. The wind shifted at some point, a small mercy, the only one the morning offered, and the fire turned back on itself at the eastern edge. By the time full dawn arrived, they had it contained, not extinguished, but contained, burning itself out against the section of cleared ground along the old creek bed. They stood at the edge of the scorched pasture in the early light, all of them, and looked at what was left. About 40 acres of grazing land was gone. The fence along the eastern line was destroyed. 3 cattle had been injured, one badly enough that Wade made the quiet, grim decision an hour later, and Billy handled it. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Santos said very quietly, "There was a start point near the southeast corner. Not lightning. The grass was cut back around it." Everyone looked at him. "I saw it when we were coming around the edge," he said. "The fire started in too small a circle. And the cut grass. Someone cleared a space to set it." Wade's face did something that Clara had not seen before. Not anger exactly, because anger moves, and what she saw in his face was still. Very, very still. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure," Santos said. Clara looked at her husband and watched him make the decision to stay controlled, which was its own kind of effort, and she knew it. "All right," Wade said after a moment. "Don't touch anything in that corner. I want to look at it myself before we do any fence repair." He looked at it for a long time later that morning. Clara stood beside him and looked at it too. There was not much to see, just the smaller circle of scorched earth amid the larger burn, and the neat edges where the grass had been cleared to a radius that was too deliberate to be natural. But it was enough. You only needed enough. "He's escalating," Clara said. "Yes, which means the Garrett connection scared him." She turned this over. "He found out somehow, which means someone in the territory is talking to him about our business. Or he's just watching the ranch." Wade's voice was flat. "Either way. We could go to the sheriff." Wade made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Brannick's been taking Holt's money for the better part of 2 years. Not directly, nothing that direct, but the water rights decisions, the way the office handled the property survey last spring. Brannick does what Holt needs him to do." Clara had suspected as much, but hadn't had confirmation. "Then we documented ourselves. We write down what Santos saw, what we found, the date, everything. We send copies to 2 different places, not just kept here." "Who do we send it to?" "Garrett," she said, "and the Territorial Land Office in Phoenix. Not Redstone. Phoenix." She paused. "We start building a record. If there's ever a point where the sheriff can't look away anymore, we want a record that predates whatever Holt's version of events is." Wade looked at her. He had that look he sometimes got, Not surprise, because he'd stopped being surprised by how her mind worked, but something that might have been gratitude, or might have been something he didn't have a clean word for. "All right," he said. The loss of the South pasture hit them harder than Clara let herself show. She ran the numbers 3 times, hoping the third time would produce a different result. And it didn't. With 40 acres of grazing gone and the cost of fence repair and the reduced carrying capacity going into winter, the margin they'd been operating on became something closer to the edge of a knife. Garrett's visit was still a month away. The Maricopa buyers were still theoretical. What was not theoretical was the feed bill for winter and the 2 ranch hands' wages and the pump mechanism that had finally failed completely in September and been replaced with the last of the cash reserve. She sat with the figures one night after Wade had gone to bed, and she let herself be, for about half an hour, genuinely frightened. Not panicked. Panic was not useful, and she'd never been prone to it. But honest fear, the kind that comes from looking at a real problem clearly and seeing that it is actually a real problem, is useful if you let it be, because it focuses the mind considerably. She thought about what she knew. She knew the cattle that remained were good stock. The fire hadn't reached the main herd, which was the thing that would have been truly unrecoverable. She knew Garrett was coming. She knew the Maricopa buyers needed reliable suppliers, and that reliable was something Red Hollow could offer even in a difficult season. She knew they had the land and the labor and the infrastructure, battered as it was. And she knew something else, which she'd been considering for 3 weeks without quite saying aloud. There were other ranchers in the territory who were dealing with variations of the same pressure. Holt's water rights manipulation didn't only affect Red Hollow. 2 operations to the north, the Vasquez family's place, and a rancher named Holt, no relation, named Prescott, had both been squeezed by the same water access games. She'd heard this from Billy, who heard everything eventually through the slow information network of ranch hands who talked to each other at the feed store and the farrier. If Red Hollow couldn't get around Holt alone, perhaps it didn't have to do it alone. She brought it up to Wade the next morning, the idea still rough at the edges, and watched him listen with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered. "A cooperative supply arrangement," he said when she finished. "Share transportation costs to Maricopa. Present as a larger combined volume to Garrett, which makes us more attractive to the railroad buyers than any one operation would be individually," Clara said. "And it means Holt can't cut any one of us off completely without losing all of us simultaneously." Wade was quiet for a moment. "Vasquez and I have history, not bad history. We just haven't. We keep to ourselves mostly." Prescott: "I barely know." "I know," she said. "But you have something in common with both of them that matters more than history." He looked at her. Holt, she agreed. She was the one who rode out to speak with Elena Vasquez, because Wade suggested it, and she had agreed with his reasoning. Vasquez's wife was the one who handled the business decisions on that operation, and a woman coming to propose an arrangement would land differently than a man showing up unannounced. Clara knew this was probably true, even if it said something irritating about how the world worked. Elena Vasquez was a compact, direct woman in her 40s, with iron-gray streaks in her dark hair, and the hands of someone who had been working land since before Clara was born. She received Clara in the kitchen of her own house, a larger operation than Red Hollow, better established, the kitchen actually finished and properly furnished, and listened to the proposal over coffee without interrupting. When Clara finished, Elena said, "Holt put pressure on your water last spring?" "He tried to. We held the South Range rights. He got our north access in March." Elena's voice was matter-of-fact, but something behind it was not. "We've been hauling water for the upper pasture since April." "I didn't know that." "We don't advertise our problems." Elena turned her coffee cup in her hands. "This arrangement you're proposing, if Garrett is real and the Maricopa buyers are real, it makes sense. But if Garrett is real, why do you need us? You could do this on your own." "Because Holt can still cut us off from enough local buyers to make the margin unworkable," Clara said. "A bad year, a destroyed pasture, and we're already thin. But if we're 3 operations presenting to Garrett together, the volume changes what's possible. And Holt can't threaten all 3 of us simultaneously without exposing himself." Elena looked at her for a long moment. "You're Wade Mercer's wife?" "Yes." "He's a good man. Stubborn?" "Yes to both." Something in Elena's expression moved toward warmth, not all the way, but part way. "I'll talk to my husband. Come back Thursday." She went back Thursday. Elena said yes. Prescott took another week and required Wade to ride out himself, but he came back with a tentative agreement. And the week after that, when Garrett arrived at Red Hollow on a gray November morning and walked the herd and reviewed the numbers, he found not one operation but 3 presenting a combined volume that was, as Clara had calculated, exactly the kind of supply scale the Maricopa buyers needed. Garrett was a tall, angular man who had been in the cattle business for 25 years and had the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned not to show enthusiasm to sellers. He walked the herd with Wade and said very little. He looked at the documents Clara had prepared, the inventory, the carrying capacity figures, the projected spring numbers, with the careful attention of a man who was actually reading them rather than performing the act of reading them. At the end of the day, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee, he said, "The South Pasture burn is going to affect your winter numbers." "Yes," Wade said. "Can you make it up by spring?" "We'll be short on our own," Wade said. "With the Vasquez and Prescott stock counted together, the numbers work." Garrett looked at the figures one more time. Then he put the paper down and said, "I can take this to Callaway and Maricopa. I won't promise anything until I've spoken to him, but this is worth my time to take." It was the most a cautious man in his position would say, and it was enough. The news about Clara's pregnancy came to her in the quiet way those things sometimes do. Not with any dramatic announcement from her own body, just a slow accumulation of small signals over 2 weeks that she cataloged and recatalogued before she could bring herself to trust what they were telling her. She sat with it alone for 4 days, turning it over, feeling the full weight of what it meant before she said anything to anyone. She told Wade on a Sunday evening, sitting on the porch in the last light, neither of them looking at the other, both of them watching the desert go purple with dusk. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she turned to look at him. His face had done the thing she'd seen only a few times, gone fully open, all the careful management dropped at once. What was in it was complicated, and she didn't try to simplify it. Joy, she was certain of the joy, but behind it a fear that was just as real, just as present, and she knew without having to ask what the fear was about. "Wade," she said quietly. "I know," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "I know." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the porch chair. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat there as the dark came in across the desert, not saying anything else, because there wasn't anything else to say yet, only this enormous and terrifying and true thing sitting between them in the cooling air. She would not pretend to him that there was no risk. She knew what had happened to Ruth. She knew what childbirth cost women in the Arizona Territory in 1882, what it cost everywhere, and she had no interest in constructing a false comfort that would only collapse later. But she also knew this. She had walked out of Patton's boarding house with $4 and nowhere to go, and she had not collapsed then. She had cleared dead soil and run irrigation channels and faced Gerald Holt on a public street and built a business alliance out of 3 stubborn ranching families who barely knew each other. She had not survived all of that to be defeated by fear. "I'll be all right," she said. Not as a promise, because she couldn't make that promise, and they both knew it. Just as a statement of intent, which was the only honest version. Wade's hand tightened on hers. "I know you will," he said. She could hear in his voice that he was working very hard to believe it, and she loved him for the effort. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky over Red Hollow, sharp and cold, and very far away, and somewhere out in the South Range, in the pasture that was beginning its slow recovery from the fire, the cattle were settling for the night. The ranch breathed around them, imperfect and scarred and still standing. Winter settled over Red Hollow in the particular way of Arizona winters, not the killing cold of northern territories, but a dry, biting chill that got into the bones of old buildings and old people equally, that turned the desert from copper to gray and made the mornings dark longer than felt fair. Clara was 4 months along by December, and the pregnancy was not easy in the way that some women's are easy. She was tired in a way that sat bone deep, and there were mornings when the smell of the kitchen stove made her stomach revolt, and she could not always hide either of these things from Wade, no matter how much she tried. He watched her with a vigilance that she found equal parts touching and maddening. "I'm not fragile," she told him one morning, when she caught him standing in the kitchen doorway watching her carry a pot of water from the pump. "I know you're not." Then stop looking at me like I'm about to break. He came and took the pot from her anyway, not because he thought she couldn't carry it, but because it was there and he could. She let him have that. She understood the difference by now between a man who didn't trust her capabilities and a man who was afraid of something specific and expressing it the only way available to him. Wade was the second kind, and the fear underneath it had a name neither of them said often. Ruth had died in April 3 years ago in this house. Wade had found a midwife, ridden through the night, and arrived back at Red Hollow to find Billy on the porch with a look on his face that had never, in all the years since, fully left his eyes when he thought no one was watching. That was the weight Wade carried into every morning of Clara's pregnancy. She knew it, and she didn't try to take it from him because it wasn't hers to take. What she could do was be plainly, demonstrably well, eat what needed eating, sleep when she needed to sleep, and refuse to treat herself like someone waiting for disaster. That last part was as much for herself as for him. The investigation began without them. They learned about it in January through the particular grapevine that ran between ranching families and feed store conversations and the occasional letter that arrived with no return address. A woman in Redstone named Margaret Hale, the wife of a merchant, respectable, not the kind of person who was easily dismissed, had gone to a territorial land inspector named Forsyth with documents she'd held for 2 years. Financial records. Her name on a property transfer she'd never signed. A letter from Holt's lawyer Creech that contained language she could now prove was related to fraud in the sale of her late father's land. She had been afraid before. What had changed, people said, was that she'd heard about Clara. Not the version of the story Holt had told, not the thief's narrative, but the other version, the one that had been assembling itself quietly in the town's collective conscience over the months since Clara had walked back into Redstone beside Wade and held her ground on the street. People in small towns remember things. They remember the expression on a man's face when he says a woman stole from him and the expression doesn't match the words. They remember a planted watch and a forgone sheriff and a choice not to press charges that made sense only if the accusation was never meant to survive scrutiny. Forsyth was not Brannock. Forsyth was a territorial official who reported to Phoenix rather than to the local sheriff's office, which meant Holt's reach did not extend to him, or at least not far enough. He received Margaret Hale's documents on a Thursday and had begun making inquiries by the following Monday. Clara heard all of this second-hand, then third-hand, the information arriving in pieces over the course of January and February, each piece slightly clearer than the last. She tried not to put too much weight on any of it. She had learned in the long months of building something on imperfect ground that premature certainty was its own kind of danger. But she noticed that Wade, when the news came, went very quiet in a particular way. Not his thinking quiet or his grieving quiet, but a different kind. The stillness of a man who has been braced for impact for so long that he doesn't quite know what to do when it seems like it might not come. "Don't count it yet," she told him. "I know," he said. "He'll fight it. He has money and Creech and every reason to fight it. I know, Clara. I just don't want us to—" "I know." He looked at her. "I'm not counting it. I'm just—" He stopped. "It's the first time in 3 years something has moved in a direction that isn't his direction. I'm allowed to notice that." She conceded the point. Garrett came through in February with confirmation from Callaway and Maricopa. The combined supply arrangement with the Vasquez and Prescott operations had been accepted. The first contracted purchase would happen in April, when the spring calves were old enough, at a price that was, when Clara ran the numbers twice, and then showed them to Elena Vasquez, who ran them herself and confirmed better than anything Red Hollow had sold at in 4 years. She showed Wade the figures on a cold February evening and watched him read them and read them again. "This covers the winter deficit," he said, "and the fence repair, and leaves a working margin for the summer season." He set the paper down on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "You built this." "We built it. Clara." He said her name with a weight that made her look up. "You came here with a carpet bag and $4, and in 6 months you put together a trade arrangement that 3 ranching families couldn't manage on their own." He wasn't performing anything. He was just saying what was true. "I know how to run cattle. I don't know how to do what you did." She was quiet for a moment. "I know how to run cattle better than I did 6 months ago," she said finally, "because you showed me. That's how it works." He held her gaze. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. And that was the end of that conversation, but she carried it with her afterward. Not because it was flattering, but because it was specific and honest, and it came from him, which made it true in a way that flattery never was. The baby came in late March. He arrived after 17 hours of labor that Clara refused, in the moment and afterward, to describe as anything other than the hardest work she had ever done in her life. The midwife Wade had hired, a no-nonsense woman from Millhaven named Frances Dodd, who had delivered more than 200 children and had the unflappable manner of someone who had seen all available outcomes, stayed for the entire night and spoke to Clara in the direct, practical tone that Clara needed and that some other women might not have. "You're doing the work," Frances said, around 3 in the morning, when Clara was exhausted in a way that went beyond any normal meaning of the word. "Your body knows what it's doing. You don't have to manage it. Just let it work." "I manage things," Clara said through gritted teeth. "It's what I do." "Not this," Frances said. "Not tonight." It was, Clara later thought, possibly the most useful thing anyone had ever said to her. Wade was outside the bedroom door for most of it. She could hear him, not pacing because he wasn't the pacing sort, but present. The occasional footstep, the sound of him sitting down and getting up again in the hallway chair. Billy had made him coffee at some point, and he'd apparently drunk it without noticing, and then made a second pot and left it. Santos had come in from the bunkhouse and then not known what to do with himself and gone back out. The ranch held its breath around them in the gray hours before dawn. When Frances opened the door and said, "Come in, Mr. Mercer," her voice had the matter-of-fact warmth of someone delivering good news who is too professional to make a scene of it. Wade came through the door and stopped. Clara was sitting up against the pillows, worn to the absolute margins of herself, with their son in her arms. She looked at Wade's face. She had seen that face in its careful everyday version, and its rare open version, and its grief version, and its anger version, and the version it made in the dark when he thought she was asleep. She had not seen this version before, and she understood in an instant that she was looking at something he had not shown anyone in 3 years. Not since the last time he'd been in this room for the last time it had mattered, and the outcome had been the one that had closed him down like a shuttered house. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with an expression that was terrified and wrecked and overwhelmed and some other thing that didn't have a name, some kind of specific, private, enormous relief. "He's all right?" he said. His voice was barely there. "He's all right," Clara said, "and I'm all right." He looked at her. She met his eyes and held them, and she let him see that she was telling him the truth. He put one hand out very carefully and touched the baby's face with 2 fingers, the side of his cheek. Just the lightest touch, the touch of someone who had decided to let himself believe in something good and was still waiting for it to be taken back. The baby's face scrunched slightly and then settled. Wade made a sound that was not a word. He bent his head and she couldn't see his face for a moment, and she reached over with her free hand and put it on his back, between his shoulder blades, and left it there. They named him Thomas. Thomas Mercer came into the world weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces with a full head of dark hair and an extremely strong opinion about hunger. And from the first week of his life, it was clear he had inherited his mother's quality of absolute certainty about what he wanted and his father's quality of extreme patience when waiting for it. Billy, who had been around since before Wade's first marriage and through everything since, held the baby on his 3rd day of life with the careful reverence of a man handling something that mattered, and said nothing for a long time. "You look like an uncle," Clara told him. He cleared his throat. "I'm too old to be anyone's uncle." "You look like one anyway." He handed the baby back and went and found something to do with his hands in the yard, which was his way. And Santos brought extra firewood that nobody had asked for, and Dove fixed the leaning porch post that had been waiting since Clara arrived, and nobody explained why they were all doing these extra things on that particular day. The investigation findings came in April. Forsyth presented his preliminary report to the territorial court in Phoenix, and it was, by all accounts, that reached Clara and Wade through the reliable channels of the territory's information networks, considerable. Fraud in 4 documented land transactions, including Margaret Hale's father's property. Conspiracy in the manipulation of water rights assessments. Financial coercion documented across 3 separate properties. And the arson, which Forsyth had pursued with the help of a fire investigator brought from Phoenix, a man who looked at the southeast corner of Red Hollow's burned pasture and agreed with Santos's read and wrote it into the official record in language that was precise and damning. Holt retained 3 lawyers, which the territory noted as the kind of decision a guilty man makes. Creech disappeared on a Tuesday in April, which was the kind of decision an accessory makes. The formal arrest of Gerald Holt happened on a Thursday morning in May, outside his own offices on Redstone's Main Street. Clara was not there to see it. She was at Red Hollow, in the garden, planting the second season's beds with Thomas in a basket in the shade of the porch, listening to Billy describe it from across the yard in his particular economy of words. Brannick tried to drag it out, Billy said. Territorial men didn't let him. 2 deputies from Phoenix. Was there a crowd? Clara asked, pushing a tomato seedling into the prepared soil. Some. Were any of them people who watched me get thrown out of Patton's? Billy was quiet for a moment. Probably most of them, he said. She pressed the soil firm around the seedling with her palm, the way she'd learned to do in that first season. Not too hard, not too gentle, enough to hold. Good, she said. Billy made a sound that was approximately a laugh. The news moved through the territory the way significant things move, fast and slightly distorted by the time it arrived anywhere, but the core of it intact. Holt's empire did not collapse overnight. Empires built on controlled relationships take time to unravel because there are so many threads, and threads pulled individually rather than all at once. But unravel it did, over the following months. Buyers who had been avoiding Red Hollow and the Vasquez and Prescott operations began quietly, then openly, doing business. The water rights case was reviewed by the territorial court, and 2 of Holt's disputed access claims were overturned. 3 other women came forward to the territorial investigation with grievances that filled in parts of Gerald Holt's history that went back further than anyone in Redstone had publicly acknowledged. Margaret Hale, when Clara met her at last in the summer, was a reserved woman who carried herself as if she expected the ground under her to shift without warning. They had coffee in Redstone at the bakery, the same bakery Clara had smelled on her first return trip to town with Wade, and they sat and talked for 2 hours. They were not immediately friends in the easy sense. They were 2 women who had been damaged by the same man in different ways and who recognized in each other something true, and that was its own kind of connection, specific and durable. Were you afraid? Margaret asked her, at some point in that conversation, when you came back to town that day. Yes, Clara said without hesitation. You didn't look it. I found, Clara said, that fear and action are not mutually exclusive. You can be afraid and still put one foot in front of the other. The trick is not to wait until you're not afraid, because that day doesn't usually come. Margaret was quiet, looking at her coffee. I waited 2 years. And then you moved, Clara said. That's what matters. The years after did not produce a life that was easy or untroubled, because nothing about the desert or the ranching business or the territory was easy or untroubled, and Clara had never expected otherwise. The South Pasture recovered slowly over 2 seasons. The Maricopa arrangement with Garrett proved stable and then, after the second year, genuinely profitable, well beyond what Clara's original calculations had suggested. The cooperative arrangement between Red Hollow and the Vasquez and Prescott operations became a model that other ranching families in the territory began to replicate. Not because anyone organized them toward it, but because useful things spread when people need them. Wade bought the water rights on the North Range and the settlement of Holt's assets, which resolved the 3-year pressure at a price that was, as Clara noted once when they were reviewing the property records, ironic enough to be almost funny. He spent 3 years trying to take it from us, she said, and we ended up buying it from his wreckage. Don't enjoy that too much, Wade said. I'm enjoying it the right amount. He looked sideways at her and didn't quite smile, which was his version of genuine amusement. Thomas learned to walk in the kitchen, grabbing the table legs for support, and then to talk in the particular bilingual chaos that resulted from Santos speaking Spanish in the yard and Clara speaking plain English, and Billy occasionally speaking what appeared to be neither. He was not a docile child. He had opinions about everything from very early, and Clara recognized this as both familiar and, from the parental perspective, exhausting in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. He argued with me about breakfast this morning, she told Wade when Thomas was 2. He's 2 years old. You argue about everything, Wade said. I argue about things that matter. He's 2. Breakfast matters to him. She didn't have a good answer to that, which was unusual enough that Wade remembered it for years. 2 more children came, a daughter they named Rose, and a second boy they named Jack. And the house that had once been a silent, dusty shell with curtains on the floor grew into something else entirely, the kind of place that was never quite clean and never quite quiet, and where the chairs at the kitchen table had been increased to accommodate everyone without any formal decision being made to do so. Santos ate with them most evenings after Jack was born. Billy had his own room in the house by the time Rose was walking because the bunkhouse was a long, cold walk in winter, and he wasn't getting younger and nobody was willing to pretend otherwise. And Billy had accepted the room with the dignity of a man who hadn't been going to ask but was glad to be offered. They were not a perfect family. Clara and Wade fought. Not violently, not cruelly, but with the honest friction of 2 people who both had strong views and had never acquired the habit of pretending otherwise. There were seasons when the ranch pushed against their margin and the worry of it sat in the house like a third presence. There were winters when Wade went back to that internal distance she'd learned to recognize in him. Grief cycling through in the way it does for people who've lost someone central. And she'd learned over the years that the best she could do was be plainly present without demanding anything from him during it. But those things were the texture of the life rather than the failure of it, and Clara had long since made her peace with the distinction. What she thought about, in the moment she allowed herself to look backward, and she was not given much to looking backward, it wasn't her nature, was not the hardship. What she thought about was the particular chain of small decisions that linked one life to another. A woman refusing a proposal and having it cost her everything that was easiest to take. A man choosing to step out of a shadow when the easier choice was to walk on. A room that was a former pantry with a window that faced east and a floor she had swept until it was clean. People told their children that things happened for reasons, that suffering taught lessons. Clara didn't quite believe that. She thought suffering happened because the world contained people who were willing to cause it, and what you did with that was a choice, not a lesson handed to you from above. The lesson, if there was one, was something you chose to find, something you carved out of the wreckage yourself, and it cost something to do that, and it was worth the cost. That was the message she tried to give her children, not in speeches but in practice. You do not wait for the world to be fair before you move. You document what you know, you build what you can, you find the people who are facing the same wall and stand with them, and you keep going. Fear is a fact. It is not, however, a decision. Thomas asked her once. He was 12 by then, already that particular age where children begin asking parent-sized questions. Why she had gotten into Wade's wagon that day instead of taking the road. Clara thought about it genuinely, the way she thought about things that deserved an honest answer. Because I looked at him, she said, and he wasn't pretending to be anything he wasn't, and I decided that was worth the risk. Thomas considered this with the concentrated expression he'd had since he was 2 years old. How did you know he wasn't just pretending really well? I didn't know, she said. That's the whole point. You never know for certain. You read what you can read, you decide what you can decide, and then you get in the wagon. She paused. The other option was the road, and the road went nowhere specific. Thomas didn't say anything for a while. Then, did you regret it? She looked at him. This 12-year-old person who had arrived in the world during a 17-hour fight she'd won on stubbornness and a midwife's instruction to stop managing everything for one night, who had walked in this kitchen and argued about breakfast at 2 years old and was now asking her questions she'd asked herself in the dark for years before she had answers. No, she said. Not once. Years move the way years move when you're not watching them closely. Not fast, not slow, just continuous, the way water moves in the irrigation channels she'd cleared in that first summer, steady and purposeful and shaping the ground without drama. She was in her 60s when she sat on the repaired porch. The post had been replaced twice since Dove first fixed it, most recently by Thomas, who had done it properly with new lumber from Millhaven, and watched her grandchildren run the length of the south pasture, recovered now and green with the fall grass that had come in after the October rains. Wade sat beside her in the other chair. He was older in the way of men who have worked outdoors their whole lives. The lines in his face deep and permanent, his hair gone fully white, but his hands still the same capable shape they'd been the day he stood outside a livery holding his hat and looking at her with creekwater eyes that were trying to figure out what was actually useful. Those eyes were the same. She'd noticed this over the decades, that the thing most essentially him had not changed, only the edges around it. Billy would have liked this, he said, watching the grandchildren. He would have complained about the noise. And then stayed to watch anyway. Yes, she said, and then stayed. Billy had died 4 years ago, peacefully and in the room they'd given him, which was how he would have chosen it if he'd been consulted. She still set a cup at the kitchen table some mornings before she caught herself, and she'd stopped apologizing to herself for it. The ranch below them was not the ranch she'd arrived at. The house had been expanded twice. The garden was larger than she could manage alone anymore, so Thomas's wife Nadia had taken over the eastern beds and ran them with a systematic efficiency that Clara genuinely respected. The bunkhouse housed a different set of hands now. Younger, with families of their own, 3 of whom had children running in that pasture right now. She had not built this alone. That was the thing she tried to be honest about, because she had met women who told the story of their lives as if they had done it all by themselves, and she understood the impulse, the need to claim what you'd made, but she'd never quite respected the construction. You did not build anything that lasted without the people who stayed beside you while you were building it. Wade. Billy. Santos, who had moved on 10 years ago but still wrote letters at Christmas, which she answered. Elena Vasquez, who had been a business partner and then a genuine friend over 30 years of neighboring. Margaret Hale, who had stepped forward when she was afraid because a woman she barely knew had once walked down a street and not looked down. You built with what you had. You stayed when things were difficult. You told the truth when it was easier not to. That was all of it, really. Everything else was specific to the circumstances. The grandchildren were shouting something at each other across the pasture, some argument about the rules of whatever game they'd invented, their voices thin and high in the afternoon air. Wade reached over and put his hand on her arm, the way he'd put his hand on hers on the wagon seat the day they rode back from Millhaven married, not making anything of it, just there. She put her hand over his. The south pasture ran green to the far fence line. The irrigation channels that Thomas had rebuilt and improved ran their patient course through the earth. The kitchen window was visible from the porch, and the herbs on the windowsill caught the slant of the afternoon sun. A woman once thrown into the dust had stayed down for about 4 minutes and then gotten up and found a broom. That was the whole story. Everything else was just what happened after. End.